The Growing Stone. The automobile swung clumsily around the curve in the red sandstone trail, now a mass of mud. The headlights suddenly picked out in the night, first on one side of the road, then on the other. Two wooden huts with sheet metal roofs. On the right, near the second one, a tower of coarse beams could be made out in the light fog. From the top of the tower, a metal cable, invisible at its starting point, shone as it sloped down into the light from the car before disappearing behind the embankment that blocked the road. The car slowed down and stopped a few yards from the huts. The man who emerged from the seat to the right of the driver labored to extricate himself from the car. As he stood up, his huge, broad frame lurched a little. In the shadow beside the car, solidly planted on the ground and weighed down by fatigue, he seemed to be listening to the idling motor. Then he walked in the direction of the embankment and entered the cone of light from the headlights. He stopped at the top of the slope, his broad back outlined against the darkness. After a moment he turned around. In the light from the dashboard, he could see the chauffeur's black face, smiling. The man signaled and the chauffeur turned off the motor. At once, a vast cool silence fell over the trail and the forest. Then the sound of the waiter could be heard. The man looked at the river below him, visible solely as a broad dark motion, flecked with occasional shimmers. A denser, motionless darkness, far beyond, must be the other bank. By looking fixedly, however, one could see on that still bank a yellowish light like an oil lamp in the distance. The big man turned back toward the car and nodded. The chauffeur switched off the lights, turned them on again, then blinked them regularly. On the embankment the man appeared and disappeared, taller and more massive each time he came back to life. Suddenly, on the other bank of the river, a lantern held up by an invisible arm swung back and forth several times. At a final signal from the lookout, the chauffeur turned off his lights once and for all. The car and the man disappeared into the night. With the lights out, the river was almost visible, for at least a few of its long liquid muscles shining intermittently. On each side of the road, the dark masses of forest foliage stood out against the sky and seemed very near. The fine rain that had soaked the trail an hour earlier was still hovering in the warm air, intensifying the silence and immobility of this broad clearing in the virgin forest. In the black sky, misty stars flickered, but from the other bank rose sounds of chains and muffled plashings. Above the butt on the right of the man still waiting there, the cable stretched taut. A dull creaking began to run along it, just as there rose from the river a faint yet quite audible sound of stirred-up water. The creaking became more regular. The sound of water spread farther and then became localized as the lantern grew larger. Now its yellowish halo could be clearly seen. The halo gradually expanded and again contracted while the lantern shone through the mist and began to light up from beneath a sort of square roof of dried palms supported by thick bamboos. This crude shelter, around which vague shadows were moving, was slowly approaching the bank. When it was about in the middle of the river, three little men, almost black, were distinctly outlined in the yellow light, naked from the waist up and wearing conical hats. They stood still with feet apart, leaning somewhat to offset the strong drift of the river pressing with all its invisible water against the side of a big crude raft that eventually emerged from the darkness. When the ferry came still closer, the man could see behind the shelter on the downstream side two tall Negroes, likewise wearing nothing but broad straw hats and cotton trousers. Side by side, they weighed with all their might on long poles that sank slowly into the river toward the stern, while the Negroes, with the same slow motion, bent over the water as far as their balance would allow. In the bow, the three mulattoes, still and silent, watched the bank approach, without raising their eyes toward the man waiting for them. The ferry suddenly bumped against something, and the lantern, swaying from the shock, lighted up a pier jutting into the water. The tall Negroes stood still with hands above their heads, gripping the ends of the poles, which were barely stuck in the bottom, but their taut muscles rippled constantly, with a motion that seemed to come from the very thrust of the water. The other ferrymen looped chains over the posts on the dock, leaped onto the boards, and lowered a sort of gangplank that covered the bow of the raft with its inclined plane. The man returned to the car and slid in, while the chauffeur stepped on the starter. The car slowly climbed the embankment, pointed its hood toward the sky, and then lowered it toward the river as it tackled the downward slope. With brakes on, it rolled forward, slipped somewhat on the mud, stopped, started up again. It rolled onto the pier with a noise of bouncing planks, reached the end, where the mulattoes, still silent, were standing on either side and plunged slowly toward the raft. The raft ducked its nose in the water as soon as the front wheel struck it and almost immediately bobbed back to receive the car's full weight. Then the chauffeur ran the vehicle to the stern, in front of the square roof where the lantern was hanging. At once the mulattoes swung the inclined plane back onto the pier and jumped simultaneously onto the ferry, pushing it off from the muddy bank. The river strained under the raft and raised it on the surface of the water, where it drifted slowly at the end of the long drawbar, running along the cable overhead. The tall Negroes relaxed their effort and drew in their poles. The man and the chauffeur got out of the car and came over to stand on the edge of the raft facing upstream. No one had spoken during the maneuver, and even now each remained in his place, motionless and quiet except for one of the tall Negroes who was rolling a cigarette in coarse paper. The man was looking at the gap through which the river sprang from the vast Brazilian forest and swept down toward them. Several hundred yards wide at that point, the muddy, silky waters of the river pressed against the side of the ferry, and then, unimpeded at the two ends of the raft, sheared off and again spread out in a single powerful flood, gently flowing through the dark forest toward the sea in the night. A stale smell, come from the water or the spongy sky, hung in the air. Now the slapping of the water under the ferry could be heard, and at intervals the calls of bullfrogs from the two banks or the strange cries of birds. The big man approached the small, thin chauffeur, who was leaning against one of the bamboos with his hands in the pockets of his dungarees, once blue, but now covered with the same red dust that had been blowing in their faces all day long. A smile spread over his face, all wrinkled in spite of his youth. Without really seeing them, he was staring at the faint stars still swimming in the damp sky. But the birds' cries became sharper, unfamiliar chattering mingled with them, and almost at once the cable began to creak. The tall Negroes plunged their poles into the water and groped blindly for the bottom. The man turned around toward the shore they had just left. Now that shore was obscured by the darkness and the water, vast and savage like the continent of trees stretching beyond it for thousands of kilometers. Between the nearby ocean and this sea of vegetation, the handful of men drifting at that moment on a wild river seemed lost. When the raft bumped the new pier, it was as if, having cast off all moorings, they were landing on an island in the darkness after days of frightened sailing. Once on land, the men's voices were at last heard. The chauffeur had just paid them, and with voices that sounded strangely gay in the heavy night, they were saying farewell in Portuguese as the car started up again. They said 60, the kilometers to Iguape. 3 hours more and it'll be over. Socrates is happy, the chauffeur announced. The man laughed with a warm, hearty laugh that resembled him. Me too, Socrates, I'm happy too. The trail is hard. Too heavy, Mr. Darast, you too heavy. And the chauffeur laughed too, as if he would never stop. The car had taken on a little speed. It was advancing between high walls of trees and inextricable vegetation, amidst a soft, sweetish smell. Fireflies on the wing constantly crisscrossed in the darkness of the forest, and every once in a while red-eyed birds would bump against the windshield. At times a strange, savage sound would reach them from the depths of the night, and the chauffeur would roll his eyes comically as he looked at his passenger. The road kept turning and crossed little streams on bridges of wobbly boards. After an hour, the fog began to thicken. A fine drizzle began to fall, dimming the car's lights. Despite the jolts, Darast was half asleep. He was no longer riding in the damp forest, but on the roads of the Serra that they had taken in the morning as they left São Paulo. From those dirt trails constantly rose the red dust which they could still taste, and on both sides, as far as the eye could see, it covered the sparse vegetation of the plains, the harsh sun, the pale mountains full of ravines, the starved zebus encountered along the roads, with a tired flight of ragged urubus as their only escort, the long, endless crossing of an endless desert. He gave a start. The car had stopped. Now they were in Japan. Fragile houses on both sides of the road and, in the houses, furtive kimonos. The chauffeur was talking to a Japanese wearing soiled dungarees and a Brazilian straw hat. Then the car started up again. He said only 40 kilometers. Where were we? In Tokyo? No. Registro. In Brazil, all the Japanese come here. Why? Don't know. They're yellow, you know, Mr. Darast. But the forest was gradually thinning out, and the road was becoming easier, though slippery. The car was skidding on sand. The window let in a warm, damp breeze that was rather sour. You smell it? The chauffeur asked, smacking his lips. That's the good old sea. Soon, Iguape. If we have enough gas, Darast said, and he went back to sleep peacefully. Sitting up in bed early in the morning, Darast looked in amazement at the huge room in which he had just awakened. The lower half of the big walls was newly painted brown. Higher up, they had once been painted white, and patches of yellowish paint covered them up to the ceiling. 2 rows of beds faced each other. Darast saw only one bed unmade at the end of his row, and that bed was empty. But he heard a noise on his left and turned toward the door, where Socrates, a bottle of mineral water in each hand, stood laughing. Happy memory, he said. Darast shook himself. Yes. The hospital in which the mayor had lodged them the night before was named Happy Memory. Sure memory, Socrates continued. They told me first build hospital, later build water. Meanwhile, happy memory, take fizz water to wash. He disappeared, laughing and singing, not at all exhausted apparently by the cataclysmic sneezes that had shaken him all night long and kept Darast from closing an eye. Now, Darast was completely awake. Through the iron-latticed window, he could see a little red earth courtyard soaked by the rain that was noiselessly pouring down on a clump of tall aloes. A woman passed holding a yellow scarf over her head. Darast lay back in bed, then sat up at once and got out of the bed, which creaked under his weight. Socrates came in at that moment. For you, Mr. Darast. The mayor is waiting outside. But seeing the look on Darast's face, he added, Don't worry, he never in a hurry. After shaving with the mineral water, Darast went out under the portico of the building. The mayor, who had the proportions and under his gold-rimmed glasses, the look of a nice little weasel, seemed lost in dull contemplation of the rain. But a charming smile transfigured him as soon as he saw Darast. Holding his little body erect, he rushed up and tried to stretch his arms around the engineer. At that moment, an automobile drove up in front of them on the other side of the low wall, skidded in the wet clay, and came to a stop on an angle. The judge, said the mayor. Like the mayor, the judge was dressed in navy blue, but he was much younger, or at least seemed so because of his elegant figure and his look of a startled adolescent. Now he was crossing the courtyard in their direction, gracefully avoiding the puddles. A few steps from Darast, he was already holding out his arms and welcoming him. He was proud to greet the noble engineer who was honoring their poor village. He was delighted by the priceless service the noble engineer was going to do Iguape by building that little jetty to prevent the periodic flooding of the lower quarters of town. What a noble profession, to command the waters and dominate rivers. Ah, surely the poor people of Iguape would long remember the noble engineer's name, and many years from now would still mention it in their prayers. Darest, captivated by such charm and eloquence, thanked him, and didn't dare wonder what possible connection a judge could have with a jetty. Besides, according to the mayor, it was time to go to the club, where the leading citizens wanted to receive the noble engineer appropriately before going to inspect the poorer quarters. Who were the leading citizens? Well, the mayor said, myself as mayor, Mr. Carvalho here, the harbor captain, and a few others less important. Besides, you won't have to pay much attention to them, for they don't speak French. Darest called Socrates and told him he would meet him when the morning was over. All right, Socrates said. I'll go to the garden of the fountain. The garden? Yes, everybody knows. Have no fear, Mr. Darest. The hospital, Darest noticed as he left it, was built on the edge of the forest, and the heavy foliage almost hung over the roofs. Over the whole surface of the trees was falling a sheet of fine rain, which the dense forest was noiselessly absorbing like a huge sponge. The town, some 100 houses roofed with faded tiles, extended between the forest and the river, and the water's distant murmur reached the hospital. The car entered drenched streets and almost at once came out on a rather large rectangular square, which showed among numerous puddles in its red clay the marks of tires, iron wheels, and horseshoes. All around, brightly plastered low houses closed off the square, behind which could be seen the 2 round towers of a blue and white church of colonial style. A smell of salt water coming from the estuary dominated this bare setting. In the center of the square, a few wet silhouettes were wandering. Along the houses, a motley crowd of gauchos, Japanese, half-breed Indians, and elegant leading citizens, whose dark suits looked exotic here, were sauntering with slow gestures. They stepped aside with dignity to make way for the car, then stopped and watched it. When the car stopped in front of one of the houses on the square, a circle of wet gauchos silently formed around it. At the club, a sort of small bar on the second floor furnished with a bamboo counter and iron cafe tables. The leading citizens were numerous. Sugar-cane alcohol was drunk in honor of Darest after the mayor, glass in hand, had wished him welcome and all the happiness in the world. But while Darest was drinking near the window, a huge lout of a fellow in riding breeches and leggings came over and, staggering somewhat, delivered himself of a rapid and obscure speech in which the engineer recognized solely the word passport. He hesitated and then took out the document, which the fellow seized greedily. After having thumbed through the passport, he manifested obvious displeasure. He resumed his speech, shaking the document under the nose of the engineer, who, without getting excited, merely looked at the angry man. Whereupon the judge, with a smile, came over and asked, "What was the matter?" For a moment the drunk scrutinized the frail creature, who dared to interrupt him, and then, staggering even more dangerously, shook the passport in the face of his new interlocutor. Darest sat peacefully beside a cafe table and waited. The dialogue became very lively, and suddenly the judge broke out in a deafening voice that one would never have suspected in him. Without any forewarning, the lout suddenly backed down like a child caught in the act. At a final order from the judge, he sidled toward the door like a punished schoolboy and disappeared. The judge immediately came over to explain to Darest, in a voice that had become harmonious again, that the uncouth individual who had just left was the chief of police, that he had dared to claim the passport was not in order, and that he would be punished for his outburst. Judge Carvalho then addressed himself to the leading citizens, who stood in a circle around him and seemed to be questioning them. After a brief discussion, the judge expressed solemn excuses to Darest, asked him to agree that nothing but drunkenness could explain such forgetfulness of the sentiments of respect and gratitude that the whole town of Iguape owed him, and finally asked him to decide himself on the punishment to be inflicted on the wretched individual. Darest said that he didn't want any punishment, that it was a trivial incident, and that he was particularly eager to go to the river. Then the mayor spoke up to assert with much simple good humor that a punishment was really mandatory, that the guilty man would remain incarcerated, and that they would all wait until their distinguished visitor decided on his fate. No protest could soften that smiling severity, and Durast had to promise that he would think the matter over. Then they agreed to visit the poorer quarters of the town. The river was already spreading its yellowish waters over the low, slippery banks. They had left behind them the last houses of Iguape, and stood between the river and a high, steep embankment to which clung huts made of clay and branches. In front of them, at the end of the embankment, the forest began again abruptly, as on the other bank. But the gap made by the water rapidly widened between the trees until reaching a vague grayish line that marked the beginning of the sea. Without saying a word, Durast walked toward the slope, where the various flood levels had left marks that were still fresh. A muddy path climbed toward the huts. In front of them, Negroes stood silently staring at the newcomers. Several couples were holding hands, and on the edge of the mound, in front of the adults, a row of black children with bulging bellies and spindly legs were gaping with round eyes. When he arrived in front of the huts, Durast beckoned to the harbor captain. He was a fat, laughing Negro, wearing a white uniform. Durast asked him in Spanish if it were possible to visit a hut. The captain was sure it was. He even thought it a good idea, and the noble engineer would see very interesting things. He harangued the Negroes at length, pointing to Durast and to the river. They listened without saying a word. When the captain had finished, no one stirred. He spoke again in an impatient voice. Then he called upon one of the men, who shook his head, whereupon the captain said a few brief words in a tone of command. The man stepped forth from the group, faced Durast, and with a gesture showed him the way, but his look was hostile. He was an elderly man with short, graying hair and a thin, wizened face, yet his body was still young, with hard, wiry shoulders and muscles visible through his cotton pants and torn shirt. They went ahead, followed by the captain and the crowd of Negroes, and climbed a new, steeper embankment, where the huts made of clay, tin, and reeds clung to the ground with such difficulty that they had to be strengthened at the base with heavy stones. They met a woman going down the path, sometimes slipping in her bare feet, who was carrying on her head an Iran drum full of water. Then they reached a small, irregular square bordered by 3 huts. The man walked toward one of them and pushed open a bamboo door on hinges made of tropical liana. He stood aside without saying a word, staring at the engineer with the same impassive look. In the hut, Durast saw nothing at first but a dying fire built right on the ground in the exact center of the room. Then, in a back corner, he made out a brass bed with a bare, broken mattress, a table in the other corner covered with earthenware dishes, and, between the two, a sort of stand supporting a color print representing St. George. Nothing else but a pile of rags to the right of the entrance and, hanging from the ceiling, a few loincloths of various colors drying over the fire. Standing still, Durast breathed in the smell of smoke and poverty that rose from the ground and choked him. Behind him, the captain clapped his hands. The engineer turned around and, against the light, saw the graceful silhouette of a black girl approach and hold out something to him. He took a glass and drank the thick sugar-cane alcohol. The girl held out her tray to receive the empty glass, and went out with such a supple motion that Durast suddenly wanted to hold her back. But on following her out, he didn't recognize her in the crowd of Negroes and leading citizens gathered around the hut. He thanked the old man, who bowed without a word. Then he left. The captain, behind him, resumed his explanations and asked when the French company from Rio could begin work, and whether or not the jetty could be built before the rainy season. Durast didn't know. To tell the truth, he wasn't thinking of that. He went down toward the cool river under the fine mist. He was still listening to that great pervasive sound he had been hearing continually since his arrival, which might have been made by the rustling of either the water or the trees. He could not tell. Having reached the bank, he looked out in the distance at the vague line of the sea, the thousands of kilometers of solitary waters leading to Africa and beyond his native Europe. "Captain," he asked, "what do these people we have just seen live on?" "They work when they're needed," the captain said. "We are poor." "Are they the poorest?" "They are the poorest." The judge, who arrived at that moment slipping somewhat in his best shoes, said they already loved the noble engineer who was going to give them work. "And, they dance and sing every day." Then, without transition, he asked Darrest if he had thought of the punishment. "What punishment?" "Why, our chief of police. Let him go." The judge said that this was not possible. There had to be a punishment. Darrest was already walking toward Iguape. In the little garden of the fountain, mysterious and pleasant under the fine rain, clusters of exotic flowers hung down along the lianas, among the banana trees and pandanus. Piles of whetstones marked the intersection of paths on which a motley crowd was strolling. Half-breeds, mulattoes, a few gauchos were chatting in low voices or sauntering along the bamboo paths to the point where groves and bush became thicker and more impenetrable. There, the forest began abruptly. Darrest was looking for Socrates in the crowd when Socrates suddenly bumped him from behind. "It's holiday," he said, laughing, and clung to Darrest's tall shoulders to jump up and down. "What holiday?" "Why, you not know," Socrates said in surprise as he faced Darrest. "The feast of good Jesus. Each year they all come to the grotto with a hammer." Socrates pointed out, not a grotto, but a group that seemed to be waiting in a corner of the garden. "You see? One day the good statue of Jesus. It came upstream from the sea. Some fishermen found it. How beautiful! How beautiful! Then they washed it here in the grotto. And now a stone grew up in the grotto. Every year it's the feast. With the hammer you break off pieces for blessed happiness. And then it keeps growing, and you keep breaking. It's the miracle." They had reached the grotto and could see its low entrance beyond the waiting men. Inside, in the darkness studded with the flickering flames of candles, a squatting figure was pounding with a hammer. The man, a thin gaucho with a long mustache, got up and came out holding in his open palm, so that all might see, a small piece of moist schist, over which he soon closed his hand carefully before going away. Another man then stooped down and entered the grotto. Darrest turned around. On all sides pilgrims were waiting, without looking at him, impassive under the water dripping from the trees in thin sheets. He too was waiting in front of the grotto, under the same film of water, and he didn't know for what. He had been waiting constantly, to tell the truth, for a month since he had arrived in this country. He had been waiting in the red heat of humid days, under the little stars of night, despite the tasks to be accomplished, the jetties to be built, the roads to be cut through, as if the work he had come to do here were merely a pretext for a surprise or for an encounter he did not even imagine, but which had been waiting patiently for him at the end of the world. He shook himself, walked away without anyone in the little group paying attention to him, and went toward the exit. He had to go back to the river and go to work. But Socrates was waiting for him at the gate, lost in voluble conversation with a short, fat, strapped pingman, whose skin was yellow rather than black. His head, completely shaved, gave even more sweep to a considerable forehead. On the other hand, his broad, smooth face was adorned with a very black beard, trimmed square. "He's champion," Socrates said by way of introduction. "Tomorrow he's in the procession." The man, wearing a sailor's outfit of heavy serge, a blue and white jersey under the pea jacket, was examining Darrest attentively with his calm black eyes. At the same time he was smiling, showing all his very white teeth between his full, shiny lips. "He speaks Spanish," Socrates said, and turning toward the stranger added, "Tell Mr. Darrest." Then he danced off toward another group. The man ceased to smile and looked at Darrest with outright curiosity. "You are interested, Captain?" I'm not a captain, Darest said. 22. That doesn't matter, but you're a noble, Socrates told me. Not I, but my grandfather was, his father too, and all those before his father. Now there is no more nobility in our country. Ah, the Negro said, laughing. I understand, everybody is a noble. No, that's not it. There are neither noblemen nor common people. The fellow reflected. Then he made up his mind. No one works, no one suffers? Yes, millions of men. Then that's the common people. In that way, yes, there is a common people. But the masters are policemen or merchants. The mulatto's kindly face closed in a frown. Then he grumbled, Buying and selling, eh? What filth! And with the police, dogs command. Suddenly he burst out laughing. You don't sell? Hardly at all. I make bridges, roads. That's good. Me, I'm a ship's cook. If you wish, I'll make you our dish of black beans. All right. The cook came closer to Darest and took his arm. Listen, I like what you tell. I'm going to tell you too. Maybe you will like. He drew him over near the gate to a damp wooden bench beneath a clump of bamboos. I was at sea, off Iguape, on a small coastwise tanker that supplies the harbors along here. It caught fire on board. Not by my fault. I know my job. No, just bad luck. We were able to launch the lifeboats. During the night, the sea got rough. It capsized the boat and I went down. When I came up, I hit the boat with my head. I drifted. The night was dark, the waters are vast, and besides, I don't swim well. I was afraid. Just then I saw a light in the distance and recognized the church of the Good Jesus in Iguape. So I told the Good Jesus that, at his procession, I would carry 100-pound stone on my head if he saved me. You don't have to believe me, but the waters became calm and my heart too. I swam slowly, I was happy, and I reached the shore. Tomorrow, I'll keep my promise. He looked at Darest in a suddenly suspicious manner. You're not laughing? No, I'm not laughing. A man has to do what he has promised. The fellow clapped him on the back. Now, come to my brother's near the river. I'll cook you some beans. No, Darest said. I have things to do. This evening, if you wish. Good. But tonight there's dancing and praying in the big hut. It's the feast for St. George. Darest asked him if he danced too. The cook's face hardened suddenly. For the first time his eyes became shifty. No, I won't dance. Tomorrow I must carry the stone. It is heavy. I'll go this evening to celebrate the saint, and then I'll leave early. Does it last long? All night, and a little into the morning. He looked at Darest with a vaguely shameful look. Come to the dance. You can take me home afterward. Otherwise, I'll stay and dance. I probably won't be able to keep from it. You like to dance? Oh yes, I like. Besides, there are cigars, saints, women. You forget everything and you don't obey anymore. There are women too? All the women of the town? Not of the town, but of the huts. The ship's cook resumed his smile. Come. The captain I'll obey, and you will help me keep my promise tomorrow. Darest felt slightly annoyed. What did that absurd promise mean to him? But he looked at the handsome, frank face, smiling trustingly at him, its dark skin gleaming with health and vitality. I'll come, he said. Now I'll walk along with you a little. Without knowing why, he had a vision at the same time of the black girl offering him the drink of welcome. They went out of the garden, walked along several muddy streets, and reached the bumpy square, which looked even larger because of the low structures surrounding it. The humidity was now dripping down the plastered walls, although the rain had not increased. Through the spongy expanse of the sky, the sound of the river and of the trees reached them somewhat muted. They were walking in step, Darest heavily, and the cook with elastic tread. From time to time the latter would raise his head and smile at his companion. They went in the direction of the church, which could be seen above the houses, reached the end of the square, walked along other muddy streets now filled with aggressive smells of cooking. From time to time, a woman, holding a plate or kitchen utensil, would peer out inquisitively from one of the doors and then disappear at once. Of the church, plunged into an old section of similar low houses, and suddenly came out on the sound of the invisible river behind the area of the huts that Durast recognized. "Good. I'll leave you. See you this evening," he said. "Yes, in front of the church." But the cook did not let go of Darast's hand. He hesitated. Finally, he made up his mind. "And you? Have you never called out? Made a promise?" "Yes, once, I believe." "In a shipwreck?" "If you wish." And Darast pulled his hand away roughly. But as he was about to turn on his heels, he met the cook's eyes. He hesitated and then smiled. "I can tell you, although it was unimportant. Someone was about to die through my fault. It seems to me that I called out." "Did you promise?" "No. I should have liked to promise." "Long ago?" "Not long before coming here." The cook seized his beard with both hands. His eyes were shining. "You are a captain," he said. "My house is yours. Besides, you are going to help me keep my promise. And it's as if you had made it yourself. That will help you too." Darast smiled, saying, "I don't think so." "You are proud, Captain." "I used to be proud. Now I'm alone. But just tell me, has your good Jesus always answered you?" "Always? No, Captain." "Well then?" The cook burst out with a gay, childlike laugh. "Well," he said, "he's free, isn't he?" At the club, where Durast lunched with the leading citizens, the mayor told him he must sign the town's guest book so that some trace would remain of the great event of his coming to Iguape. The judge found 2 or 3 new expressions to praise, besides their guest's virtues and talents, the simplicity with which he represented among them the great country to which he had the honor to belong. Darast simply said that it was indeed an honor to him and an advantage to his firm to have been awarded the allocation of this long construction job, whereupon the judge expressed his admiration for such humility. "By the way," he asked, "have you thought of what should be done to the chief of police?" Durast smiled at him and said, "Yes, I have a solution. He would consider it a personal favor and an exceptional grace if the foolish man could be forgiven in his name, so that his stay here in Iguape, where he so much enjoyed knowing the beautiful town and generous inhabitants, could begin in a climate of peace and friendship." The judge, attentive and smiling, nodded his head. For a moment he meditated on the wording as an expert, then called on those present to applaud the magnanimous traditions of the great French nation, and, turning again toward Durast, declared himself satisfied. "Since that's the way it is," he concluded, "we shall dine this evening with the chief." But Durast said that he was invited by friends to the ceremony of the dances in the huts. "Ah, yes," said the judge. "I am glad you are going. You'll see. One can't resist loving our people." That evening, Durast, the ship's cook, and his brother were seated around the ashes of a fire in the center of the butt the engineer had already visited in the morning. The brother had not seemed surprised to see him return. He spoke Spanish hardly at all, and most of the time merely nodded his head. As for the cook, he had shown interest in cathedrals, and then had expatiated at length on the black bean soup. Now night had almost fallen, and although Durast could still see the cook and his brother, he could scarcely make out in the back of the butt the squatting figures of an old woman and of the same girl who had served him. Down below, he could hear the monotonous river. The cook rose, saying, "It's time." They got up, but the women did not stir. The men went out alone. Durast hesitated, then joined the others. Night had now fallen and the rain had stopped. The pale black sky still seemed liquid. In its transparent dark water, stars began to light up low on the horizon. Almost at once they flickered out, falling one by one into the river, as if the last lights were trickling from the sky. The heavy air smelled of water and smoke. Nearby, the sound of the huge forest could be heard too, though it was motionless. Suddenly, drums and singing broke out in the distance, at first muffled and then distinct, approaching closer and closer and finally stopping. Soon after, one could see a procession of black girls, wearing low-waisted white dresses of coarse silk. In a tight-fitting red jacket adorned with a necklace of varicolored teeth, a tall Negro followed them, and, behind him, a disorderly crowd of men in white pajamas and musicians carrying triangles and broad, short drums. The cook said they should follow the men. The hut, which they reached by following the river a few hundred yards beyond the last huts, was large, empty, and relatively comfortable, with plastered walls. It had a dirt floor, a roof of thatch and reeds supported by a central pole, and bare walls. On a little palm-clad altar at the end, covered with candles that scarcely lighted half the hall, there was a magnificent colored print in which St. George, with alluring grace, was getting the better of a bewhiskered dragon. Under 1991, the altar, a sort of niche decorated with rococo paper, sheltered a little statue of red-painted clay representing a horned god, standing between a candle and a bowl of water. With a fierce look, the god was brandishing an oversized knife made of silver paper. The cook led Darius to a corner where they stood against the wall near the door. "This way," he whispered. "We can leave without disturbing." Indeed, the hut was packed tight with men and women. Already the heat was rising. The musicians took their places on both sides of the little altar. The men and women dancers separated into two concentric circles with the men inside. In the very center, the black leader in the red jacket took his stand. Darius leaned against the wall, folding his arms. But the leader, elbowing his way through the circle of dancers, came toward them, and in a solemn way said a few words to the cook. "Unfold your arms, Captain," the cook said. "You are hugging yourself and keeping the saint's spirit from descending." Obediently, Darius let his arms fall to his sides. Still leaning against the wall, with his long, heavy limbs and his big face already shiny with sweat, Darius himself looked like some bestial and kindly god. The tall Negro looked at them and, satisfied, went back to his place. At once, in a resounding voice, he intoned the opening notes of a song that all picked up in chorus, accompanied by the drums. Then the circles began to turn in opposite directions in a sort of heavy, insistent dance, rather like stamping, slightly emphasized by the double line of swaying hips. The heat had increased, yet the pauses gradually diminished. The stops became less frequent, and the dance speeded up. Without any slowing of the other's rhythm, without ceasing to dance himself, the tall Negro again elbowed his way through the circles to go toward the altar. He came back with a glass of water and a lighted candle that he stuck in the ground in the center of the hut. He poured the water around the candle in two concentric circles and, again erect, turned maddened eyes toward the roof. His whole body taut and still, he was waiting. "St. George is coming, look, look," whispered the cook, whose eyes were popping. Indeed, some dancers now showed signs of being in a trance, but a rigid trance with hands on hips, step stiff, eyes staring and vacant. Others quickened their rhythm, bent convulsively backward, and began to utter inarticulate cries. The cries gradually rose higher, and when they fused in a collective shriek. The leader, with eyes still raised, uttered a long, barely phrased outcry at the top of his lungs. In it the same words kept recurring. "You see," said the cook, "he says he is the god's field of battle." Struck by the change in his voice, Darius looked at the cook, who, leaning forward with fists clenched and eyes staring, was mimicking the other's measured stamping without moving from his place. Then he noticed that he himself, though without moving his feet, had for some little time been dancing with his whole weight. But all at once the drums began to beat violently, and suddenly the big devil in red broke loose. His eyes flashing, his four limbs whirling around him, he hopped with bent knee on one leg after the other, speeding up his rhythm until it seemed that he must eventually fly to pieces. But abruptly he stopped on the verge of one leap to stare at those around him, with a proud and terrible look while the drums thundered on. Immediately, a dancer sprang from a dark corner, knelt down, and held out a short saber to the man possessed of the spirit. The tall Negro took the saber without ceasing to look around him, and then whirled it above his head. At that moment, Darast noticed the cook dancing among the others. The engineer had not seen him leave his side. In the reddish, uncertain light, a stifling dust rose from the ground, making the air even thicker and sticking to one's skin. Darast felt gradually overcome by fatigue and breathed with ever greater difficulty. He did not even see how the dancers had got hold of the huge cigars they were now smoking while still dancing. Their strange smell filled the hut and rather made his head swim. He merely saw the cook passing near him, still dancing and puffing on a cigar. "Don't smoke," he said. The cook grunted without losing the beat, staring at the central pole with the expression of a boxer about to collapse, his spine constantly twitching in a long shudder. Beside him, a heavy negress, rolling her animal face from side to side, kept barking. But the young negresses especially went into the most frightful trance, their feet glued to the floor, and their bodies shaken from feet to head by convulsive motions that became more violent upon reaching the shoulders. Their heads would wag backward and forward, literally separated from a decapitated body. At the same time, all began to howl incessantly, with a long, collective, and toneless howl, apparently not pausing to breathe or to introduce modulations, as if the bodies were tightly knotted, muscles and nerves, in a single exhausting outburst, at last giving voice in each of them to a creature that had until then been absolutely silent. And, still howling, the women began to fall one by one. The black leader knelt by each one, and quickly and convulsively pressed her temples with his huge black-muscled hand. Then they would get up, staggering, return to the dance, and resume their howls, at first feebly, and then louder and faster, before falling again, and getting up again, and beginning over again, and for a long time more, until the general howl decreased, changed, and degenerated into a sort of coarse barking which shook them with gasps. Darast, exhausted, his muscles taut from his long dance as he stood still, choked by his own silence, felt himself stagger. The heat, the dust, the smoke of the cigars, the smell of bodies now made the air almost unbreathable. He looked for the cook, who had disappeared. Darast let himself slide down along the wall and squatted, holding back his nausea. When he opened his eyes, the air was still as stifling, but the noise had stopped. The drums alone were beating out a figured bass, and groups in every corner of the hut, covered with whitish cloths, were marking time by stamping. But in the center of the room, from which the glass and candle had now been removed, a group of black girls in a semi-hypnotic state were dancing slowly, always on the point of letting the beat get ahead of them. Their eyes closed and yet standing erect, they were swaying lightly on their toes, almost in the same spot. Two of them, fat ones, had their faces covered with a curtain of raffia. They surrounded another girl, tall, thin, and wearing a fancy costume. Darast suddenly recognized her as the daughter of his host. In a green dress and a huntress's hat of blue gauze turned up in front and adorned with plumes, she held in her hand a green and yellow bow with an arrow on the tip of which was spitted a multicolored bird. On her slim body, her pretty head swayed slowly, tipped backward a little, and her sleeping face reflected an innocent melancholy. At the pauses in the music, she staggered as if only half awake. Yet the intensified beat of the drums provided her with a sort of invisible support around which to entwine her languid arabesques until, stopping again together with the music, tottering on the edge of equilibrium, she uttered a strange bird cry, shrill and yet melodious. Darast, bewitched by the slow dance, was watching the Black Diana when the cook suddenly loomed up before him, his smooth face now distorted. The kindness had disappeared from his eyes, revealing nothing but a sort of unsuspected avidity. Coldly, as if speaking to a stranger, he said, "It's late, Captain. They are going to dance all night long, but they don't want you to stay now." With head heavy, Durast got up and followed the cook, who went along the wall toward the door. On the threshold the cook stood aside, holding the bamboo door, and Durast went out. He turned back and looked at the cook, who had not moved. "Come. In a little while you'll have to carry the stone." "I'm staying," the cook said with a set expression. "And your promise?" Without replying, the cook gradually pushed against the door that Durast was holding open with one hand. They remained this way for a second until Durast gave in, shrugging his shoulders. He went away. The night was full of fresh aromatic scents. Above the forest, the few stars in the austral sky, blurred by an invisible haze, were shining dimly. The humid air was heavy, yet it seemed delightfully cool on coming out of the hut. Durast climbed the slippery slope, staggering like a drunken man in the potholes. The forest nearby rumbled slightly. The sound of the river increased. The whole continent was emerging from the night, and loathing overcame Durast. It seemed to him that he would have liked to spew forth this whole country, the melancholy of its vast expanses, the glaucous light of its forests, and the nocturnal lapping of its big, deserted rivers. This land was too vast. Blood and seasons mingled here, and time liquefied. Life here was flush with the soil, and, to identify with it, one had to lie down and sleep for years on the muddy or dried-up ground itself. Yonder in Europe, there was shame and wrath. Here, exile or solitude, among these listless and convulsive madmen who danced to die. But through the humid night, heavy with vegetable scents, the wounded bird's outlandish cry, uttered by the beautiful sleeping girl, still reached his ears. When Durast, his head in the vice of a crushing migraine, had awakened after a bad sleep, a humid heat was weighing upon the town and the still forest. He was waiting now under the hospital portico, looking at his watch, which had stopped, uncertain of the time, surprised by the broad daylight and the silence of the town. The almost clear blue sky hung low over the first dull roofs. Yellowish urubus, transfixed by the heat, were sleeping on the house across from the hospital. One of them suddenly fluttered, opened his beak, ostensibly got ready to fly away, flapped his dusty wings twice against his body, rose a few inches above the roof, fell back, and went to sleep almost at once. The engineer went down toward the town. The main square was empty, like the streets through which he had just walked. In the distance, and on both sides of the river, a low mist hung over the forest. The heat fell vertically, and Durast looked for a shady spot. At that moment, under the overhang on one of the houses, he saw a little man gesturing to him. As he came closer, he recognized Socrates. "Well, Mr. Durast, you like the ceremony?" Durast said that it was too hot in the hut, and that he preferred the sky and the night air. "Yes," Socrates said. "In your country there's only the Mass. No one dances." He rubbed his hands, jumped on one foot, whirled about, laughed uproariously. "Not possible, they're not possible." Then he looked at Durast inquisitively. "And you, are you going to Mass?" "No." "Then, where are you going?" "Nowhere, I don't know," Socrates laughed again. "Not possible. A noble without a church, without anything." Durast laughed likewise. "Yes, you see, I never found my place, so I left." "Stay with us, Mr. Durast, I love you." "I'd like to, Socrates, but I don't know how to dance." Their laughter echoed in the silence of the empty town. "Ah," Socrates said, "I forget. The mayor wants to see you. He is lunching at the club." And without warning, he started off in the direction to the hospital. "Where are you going?" Durast shouted. Socrates imitated a snore. "Sleep, soon the procession," and, half running, he resumed his snores. The mayor simply wanted to give Darrast a place of honor to see the procession. He explained it to the engineer while sharing with him a dish of meat and rice such as would miraculously cure a paralytic. First, they would take their places on a balcony of the judge's house opposite the church to see the procession come out. Then they would go to the town hall in the main street leading to the church, which the penitents would take on their way back. The judge and the chief of police would accompany Darrast, the mayor being obliged to take part in the ceremony. The chief of police was in fact in the clubroom, and kept paying court to Darrast with an indefatigable smile, lavishing upon him incomprehensible but obviously well-meaning speeches. When Darrast left, the chief of police hastened to make a way for him, holding all the doors open before him. Under the burning sun, in the still empty town, the two men walked toward the judge's house. Their steps were the only sound heard in the silence. But all of a sudden a firecracker exploded in a neighboring street and flushed on every roof the heavy, awkward flocks of bald-necked urubus. Almost at once dozens of firecrackers went off in all directions. Doors opened, and people began to emerge from the houses and fill the narrow streets. The judge told Darrast how proud he was to receive him in his unworthy house and led him up a handsome baroque staircase painted chalky blue. On the landing, as Darrast passed, doors opened and children's dark heads popped out and disappeared at once with smothered laughter. The main room, beautiful in architecture, contained nothing but rattan furniture and large cages filled with squawking birds. The balcony on which the judge and Darrast settled overlooked the little square in front of the church. The crowd was now beginning to fill it, strangely silent, motionless under the heat that came down from the sky in almost visible waves. Only the children ran around the square, stopping abruptly to light firecrackers, and sharp reports followed one another in rapid succession. Seen from the balcony, the church with its plaster walls, its dozen blue steps, its blue and gold towers, looked smaller. Suddenly the organ burst forth within the church. The crowd turned toward the portico, drew over to the sides of the square. The men took off their hats, and the woman knelt down. The distant organ played at length something like marches. Then an odd sound of wings came from the forest. A tiny airplane with transparent wings and frail fuselage, out of place in this ageless world, came in sight over the trees, swooped a little above the square, and with the clacking of a big rattle, passed over the heads raised toward it. Then the plane turned and disappeared in the direction of the estuary. But in the shadow of the church, a vague bustle again attracted attention. The organ had stopped, replaced now by brasses and drums, invisible under the portico. Black surpliced penitents came out of the church one by one, formed groups outside the doors, and began to descend the steps. Behind them came white penitents bearing red and blue banners, then a little group of boys dressed up as angels, sodalities of children of Mary with little black and serious faces. Finally, on a multicolored shrine borne by leading citizens, sweating in their dark suits, came the effigy of the good, Jesus himself, a reed in his hand, and his head crowned with thorns, bleeding and tottering above the crowd that lined the steps. When the shrine reached the bottom of the steps, there was a pause during which the penitents tried to line up in a semblance of order. Then it was that Darrast saw the ship's cook. Bare from the waist up, he had just come out under the portico, carrying on his bearded head an enormous rectangular block set on a cork mat. With steady tread he came down the church steps, the stone perfectly balanced in the arch formed by his short muscular arms. As soon as he fell in behind the shrine, the procession moved. From the portico burst the musicians, wearing bright-colored coats and blowing into beribboned brasses. To the beat of a quick march, the penitents hastened their step and reached one of the streets opening off the square. When the shrine had disappeared behind them, nothing could be seen but the cook and the last of the musicians. Behind them, the crowd got in motion amidst exploding firecrackers, while the plane, with a great rattle of its engine, flew back over the groups trailing behind. Darrast was looking exclusively at the cook, who was disappearing into the street now, and whose shoulders he suddenly thought he saw sag. but at that distance he couldn't see well. Through the empty streets, between closed shops and bolted doors, the judge, the chief of police, and Darast reached the town hall. As they got away from the band and the firecrackers, silence again enveloped the town, and already a few Urubus returned to the places on the roofs that they seemed to have occupied for all time. The town hall stood in a long, narrow street, leading from one of the outlying sections to the church square. For the moment, the street was empty. From the balcony could be seen, as far as the eye could reach, nothing but a pavement full of potholes, in which the recent rain had left puddles. The sun, now slightly lower, was still nibbling at the windowless facades of the houses across the street. They waited a long time, so long that Darast, from staring at the reverberation of the sun on the opposite wall, felt his fatigue and dizziness returning. The empty street with its deserted houses attracted and repelled him at one and the same time. Once again, he wanted to get away from this country. At the same time, he thought of that huge stone. He would have liked that trial to be over. He was about to suggest going down to find out something when the church bells began to peal forth loudly. Simultaneously, from the other end of the street on their left, a clamor burst out, and a seething crowd appeared. From a distance, the people could be seen swarming around the shrine. Pilgrims and penitents mingled, and they were advancing, amidst firecrackers and shouts of joy, along the narrow street. In a few seconds, they filled it to the edges, advancing toward the town hall in an indescribable disorder. Ages, races, and costumes fused in a motley mass full of gaping eyes and yelling mouths. From the crowd emerged an army of tapers like lances with flames fading into the burning sunlight. But when they were close, and the crowd was so thick under the balcony that it seemed to rise up along the walls, Darast saw that the ship's cook was not there. Quick as lightning, without excusing himself, he left the balcony and the room, dashed down the staircase, and stood in the street under the deafening sound of the bells and firecrackers. There he had to struggle against the crowd of merrymakers, the taper-bearers, the shocked penitents. But, bucking the human tide with all his weight, he cut a path in such an impetuous way that he staggered and almost fell when he was eventually free, beyond the crowd, at the end of the street. Leaning against the burning hot wall, he waited until he had caught his breath. Then he resumed his way. At that moment, a group of men emerged into the street. The ones in front were walking backward, and Darast saw that they surrounded the cook. He was obviously dead tired. He would stop then, bent under the huge stone, run a little with the hasty step of stevedores and coolies, the rapid, flat-footed trot of drudgery. Gathered about him, penitents in surplices soiled with dust and candle drippings encouraged him when he stopped. On his left, his brother was walking or running in silence. It seemed to Darast that they took an interminable time to cover the space separating them from him. Having almost reached him, the cook stopped again and glanced around with dull eyes. When he saw Darast, yet without appearing to recognize him, he stood still, turned toward him. An oily, dirty sweat covered his face, which had gone gray. His beard was full of threads of saliva, and a brown, dry froth glued his lips together. He tried to smile, but motionless under his load, his whole body was trembling except for the shoulders, where the muscles were obviously caught in a sort of cramp. The brother, who had recognized Darast, said to him simply, "He already fell." And Socrates, popping up from nowhere, whispered in his ear, "Dance too much, Mr. Darast, all night long. He's tired." The cook advanced again with his jerky trot, not like a man who wants to progress, but as if he were fleeing the crushing load, as if he hoped to lighten it through motion. Without knowing how, Darast found himself at his right. He laid his hand lightly on the cook's back and walked beside him with hasty, heavy steps. At the other end of the street, the shrine had disappeared, and the crowd, which probably now filled the square, did not seem to advance any more. For several seconds, the cook, between his brother and Darast, made progress. Soon a mere space of some 20 yards separated him from the group gathered in front of the town hall to see him pass. Again, however, he stopped. Darast's hand became heavier. "Come on, Cook. Just a little more," he said. The man trembled. The saliva began to trickle from his mouth again, while the sweat literally spurted from all over his body. He tried to breathe deeply and stopped short. He started off again, took 3 steps and tottered, and suddenly the stone slipped onto his shoulder, gashing it, and then forward onto the ground, while the cook, losing his balance, toppled over on his side. Those who were preceding him and urging him on jumped back with loud shouts. One of them seized the cork mat while the others took hold of the stone to load it on him again. Leaning over him, Darast, with his bare hand, wiped the blood and dust from his shoulder, while the little man, his face against the ground, panted. He heard nothing and did not stir. His mouth opened avidly, as if each breath were his last. Darast grasped him around the waist and raised him up as easily as if he had been a child. Holding him upright in a tight clasp, with his full height leaning over him, Darast spoke into his face as if to breathe his own strength into him. After a moment, the cook, bloody and caked with earth, detached himself with a haggard expression on his face. He staggered toward the stone, which the others were raising a little, but he stopped, looked at the stone with a vacant stare, and shook his head. Then he let his arms fall at his sides and turned toward Darast. Huge tears flowed silently down his ravaged face. He wanted to speak. He was speaking, but his mouth hardly formed the syllables. "I promised," he was saying, and then, "Oh, Captain! Oh, Captain!" and the tears drowned his voice. His brother suddenly appeared behind him, threw his arms around him, and the cook, weeping, collapsed against him, defeated, with his head thrown back. Darast looked at him, not knowing what to say. He turned toward the crowd in the distance, now shouting again. Suddenly he tore the cork mat from the hands, holding it, and walked toward the stone. He gestured to the others to hold it up, and then he loaded it almost effortlessly. His head pressed down under the weight of the stone, his shoulders hunched and breathing rather hard. He looked down at his feet as he listened to the cook's sobs. Then, with vigorous tread, he started off on his own, without flagging, covered the space separating him from the crowd at the end of the street, and energetically forced his way through the first rows, which stood aside as he approached. In the hubbub of bells and firecrackers, he entered the square between 2 solid masses of onlookers, suddenly silent and gaping at him in amazement. He advanced with the same impetuous pace, and the crowd opened a path for him to the church. Despite the weight which was beginning to crush his head and neck, he saw the church and the shrine, which seemed to be waiting for him at the door. He had already gone beyond the center of the square in that direction, when brutally, without knowing why, he veered off to the left and turned away from the church, forcing the pilgrims to face him. Behind him, he heard someone running. In front of him, mouths opened on all sides. He didn't understand what they were shouting, although he seemed to recognize the one Portuguese word that was being constantly hurled at him. Suddenly Socrates appeared before him, rolling, startled eyes, speaking incoherently, and pointing out the way to the church behind him. "To the church? To the church!" was what Socrates and the crowd were shouting at him. Yet Darast continued in the direction in which he was launched, and Socrates stood aside, his arms raised in the air comically, while the crowd gradually fell silent. When Darast entered the first street, which he had already taken with the cook, and therefore knew it led to the river section, the square had become but a confused murmur behind him. The stone weighed painfully on his head now, and he needed all the strength of his long arms to lighten it. His shoulders were already stiffening when he reached the first streets on the slippery slope. He stopped and listened. He was alone. He settled the stone firmly on its cork base and went down with a cautious but still steady tread toward the huts. When he reached them, his breath was beginning to fail. His arms were trembling under the stone. He hastened his pace, finally reached the little square where the cook's butt stood, ran to it, kicked the door open, and brusquely hurled the stone onto the still glowing fire in the center of the room. And there, straightening up until he was suddenly enormous, drinking in with desperate gulps the familiar smell of poverty and ashes, he felt rising within him a surge of obscure and panting joy that he was powerless to name. When the inhabitants of the hut arrived, they found Darast standing with his shoulders against the back wall and eyes closed. In the center of the room, in the place of the hearth, the stone was half buried in ashes and earth. They stood in the doorway without advancing and looked at Darast in silence as if questioning him. But he didn't speak. Whereupon the brother led the cook up to the stone, where he dropped on the ground. The brother sat down too, beckoning to the others. The old woman joined him, then the girl of the night before, but no one looked at Darast. They were squatting in a silent circle around the stone. No sound but the murmur of the river reached them through the heavy air. Standing in the darkness, Darast listened without seeing anything, and the sound of the waters filled him with a tumultuous happiness. With eyes closed, he joyfully acclaimed his own strength. He acclaimed, once again, a fresh beginning in life. At that moment, a firecracker went off that seemed very close. The brother moved a little away from the cook and, half turning toward Darast but without looking at him, pointed to the empty place and said, "Sit down with us."